and we'll start the session with Lorella. Lorella, are you ready? So, Lorella is a research associate in linguistics and digital humanities at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History, University of Luxembourg. Her research focuses on the relationship between language, media, and society, processes of migration and migrants' representation, and on the development of critical data-driven methodologies that can assist researchers to explore large historical and textual repositories. She also researches how software can enable critical digital humanities practice by embedding the active role of the researcher in the process of knowledge production in a digital environment. So over to you, Lorella.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Because
Yes.
in presentation mode, okay, great, because in presentation mode, basically all of you disappear. Okay, so it is really a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for having me. Today, I will be talking to you about how digital humanities can help us challenge archival silences. And I have time myself, so I think I will be just 15 minutes. Please do stop me if I run over. So very quick introduction to the project. The project is called DeXTER, Deep Text Miner. Feel free to access the GitHub repository where all the code and the explanation of the project are there. The main aim of this project was to contribute research in digital epistemology, and what do I mean by that? Particularly try to foster the study of understudied sources and underrepresented languages, and these 2 points will become clear in a minute. The way the project was envisioned was to enact new ways to give visibility to those voices traditionally have been neglected. For example, the voices of migrants. Of course, the correlated aim was also to correct archival biases by giving exactly visibility to all these sources which have been historically not digitized, for example, or not included in the scholarship, typically because believed to be less worthy of scrutiny than mainstream media, for instance, or mainstream sources. And of course, another topic would be to encourage further debate about diversity and language representation in the H scholarship, which unfortunately is still mostly English-centered. And particularly this point will become apparent in 3 seconds. And the way the project was designed was to try to enrich a collection of understudied and underrepresented languages and voices, and do it with different state-of-the-art natural language processing techniques to try to enhance access and so give visibility to these resources. A quick word about the collection itself. The collection itself is the third version of Chronicle Italy. This is a corpus harvested by the Library of Congress, and it collects Italian-American newspapers of immigrants who migrated to the States at the turn of the 20th century. This is a very interesting collection because it is ethnic newspapers, and ethnic newspapers give us a very valuable insight of how migration was experienced by the migrants themselves, because these are newspapers that the migrants wrote for the community initially, and then for also to negotiate inclusion, if you will, in the American society. So reading these collections and have access to these largely neglected collections reveals complex contexts of immigration, the complex dynamics of negotiating inclusion, and also ties to the homeland. Valuable sources for studying narratives, because there are editorial parts, but also it is a sort of a way of understanding oral history, but because it is obviously from the 20th century, there wouldn't be any way for us to access the oral records of this narration. So it is sort of a compromise. And another way that we should think about enhancing the use of migrants newspapers is because they really become the missing ring between the understanding strategies of assimilation, as in order to really negotiate inclusion and create a coherence within the community. Sometimes they had to create an invention of ethnicity in order to retain heritage. Like I said, these types of collections have largely been excluded from mainstream scholarship. Please feel free to access. This is the full reference to this collection. It's open access. It is in Italian, so if you can read Italian, of course, that's a plus. And this is why this is what I meant when I said that using this collection in particular was to foster further debate and conversations in more language diversity in DH. Okay, so just a few words about the project and how this ties in with cultural heritage and the wider scholarship conversation on identity within the context of diaspora studies. It is important to understand how ethnic identity is the crucial factor that keeps a diasporic community together. So claims of some shared identity are essential to keep the diasporic community together. These claims typically take place through markers called the markers of identity, and these markers are mostly really made up. They can be cultural, they can be social, they can be biological, and so on and so forth. So whoever studies these markers typically focuses on artifacts or family or clan names, marriage traditions, food practices, and the list can go on and on. However, the important thing to think about when we study markers of identity in connection with diasporic communities in particular is that they are typically referred to references, for instance, people, organizations, or places that are distant in time or space, and sometimes they're even invented. So studying how migrants made sense of these entities over time sometimes can reveal actually how migrants expressed differently their concept of belonging over time. And the way DeXTER was set up was really with a clear intention of understanding these markers of identity. So DeXTER historicizes both migration as in terms of socioeconomic movement of people, but also the migration as it was experienced through cultural markers by the Italian diasporic community. So the main intuition behind this concept is that only when humans invest meaning in entities, these entities become markers and can be understood as markers of identity. And understanding how people talk about these entities collects, reveals the collective narrative, longing, loss, belonging, and so on and so forth. So basically what we did was to use named entity recognition techniques to extract all the entities, referential entities in these big collections, and try to add a deep layer of what this collection of these markers meant. For instance, how they were related to each other and what the sentiment was, and try to historicize all that. So I prepared a very short demo just to give you an example of how the actual app works. Feel free to explore the app. There are two versions: DeXTER, which is the full version, but also the mini DeXTER, which runs on a smaller sample. It's exactly the same. It's just for the purpose of the exercise here. So this is the world map of how migrants basically talked about identities through geopolitical entities. So, for instance, cities or countries or regions and so on and so forth. So you can really have a look at how these references changed over time. I will just quickly go through to the next screen. Here you can see how entities change over time, how they were basically referred to, and how they distributed differently across the collection. And here is a network analysis, and people can decide whether they want to focus on the positive, for instance, or the negative side of the sentiment, and they can choose the different entities here. And check how they were connected to each other, either focusing on one particular entity or one particular issue, for instance. So suppose you are interested in one particular event that happened in a particular day, and you know exactly that something happened there, and you want to know how immigrant newspapers talked about that, then you can really select the issue of the sub-collection of the newspaper, and also the date and the year when that happened, and check how on that particular day the newspaper talked about those identities and those markers and the referential entities. You can also check the sentiment of the time and have a look at the data. The sentiment, you can have a look also at the top 3 negative, the top 3 positive, and the top 3 neutral entities across the whole collection. But you can also download the data. And like I mentioned earlier, also the full repository, which is available online, open access. And then just to really conclude the presentation, I just can't advocate enough the value of studying immigrant newspapers to study migration, but also to understand how displaced people make sense of their identity over time, especially if you're dealing with historical records. So digital heritage and digital humanities really allows us to correct these archival biases. And it is my opinion that, in fact, as humanities scholars, we have a responsibility to correct these archival silences. So just to conclude, I want to really stress the importance of migration by quoting Mary Pfeiffer, who said, "Migrants may arrive penniless, but not cultureless." Thank you.
Thank you, Lorella.
So I hope I have stayed within my allocated slot.
Yes. And I wanted to apologize. I should have said this at the beginning of the session, that we will take questions after each paper. So any of you who have questions, you can either put it in the chat box. I have sent a message right when the session started. Or you can raise your hands, unmute. Can they unmute themselves, Rihanna? Okay, so we do have some questions here. So I'll take the questions from the chat. That was very interesting. I have a couple of my own, but I'll go to the questions here first. At what point do markers of identity go from representing a community away from home to... Can anyone read that? Okay, now I got it. I'm thinking of food especially, so Italian or Indian food in the UK is not the same as it is in Italy or India. So do you want to take that?
Yeah, so the question is to what extent those markers of identity, for instance, are representative of what exactly, of the community, the host community, or the heritage community? Is that the question?
For a changing community, for a new home for a changing community.
All right, okay, good. So I would say the interesting part of studying markers of identity is exactly that. So you can really see how migrant communities negotiate belonging through these markers. So for instance, food, we always say that, for instance, I always say myself the first time, always I say, oh, pizza outside Italy is not really pizza, for instance, or oh, carbonara, that's not how we make carbonara in Italy. But the interesting part is that you can really see how Italian migrants, who, for instance, migrated to the UK, then in order to negotiate belonging, they had to express their heritage identity in a way that could be understood and accepted by the host community. And you can actually see that through food, of course, but everywhere. You can see that everywhere. And it's not that it would be really wrong to say, oh, that's not really Italian, for instance, because it is. But it is the expression of Italian communities who migrated to that particular land, and that's how they negotiate inclusion. So I would say they are representative of their community, but also how they try to be accepted by the host community.
I also think that, that you are transformed yourself as you are transforming, right? So I think that applies to food too. So while you have your, your tastes and your smells, flavors, you also kind of, kind of incorporate the local, not equivalents, but, kind of the local flavors into the traditional foods. And so you have a kind of, like, for example, I know, I'm sure Deb knows this, but, if you come to India, there's a whole cuisine called Indo-Chinese, which I think the Chinese wouldn't even recognize, so you often wonder why they call it Indo-Chinese, but that's how food evolves, right? So what are some of the most, Rihanna wants to know, what are some of the most important or common markers of identity? So you mentioned places. Is there one mentioned more frequently? And the other one is like in the newspaper corpus, can you see how many different individuals contribute? Was it usually the same few people writing articles, etc., or is it more varied?
That's a very good question. Very good question.
Yes.
So I will quickly touch upon the first part of the question. The interesting part of using this technique is that you start from the concept of space, which is just a geographical entity, as it was mentioned, and then you move from there to that concept to touch to the conception of place. And place is where actually people attach meaning to a space, and that can also be invented. So the point of the exercises was to try to understand whether we could capture that change from just a space just being mentioned because it's a space, and when that space becomes mentioned because it becomes place. And of course, it's interesting. Obviously, I rush through the presentation, but feel free to explore the app. And I think what the app shows very clearly is that you can sort of see, I don't know whether it's the right way to put it, but a sort of the geographical agenda, if you will, of the Italian migrant community at the turn of the 20th century and in between the two wars. And you can see really how some countries are totally excluded by the way Italian migrants thought about the world at the time, and how some countries sort of gets lit up at specific point in history, but then completely neglected at other points. And this is also true in Italy, but also in and you can see how parts of Italy gets less mentioned. As so the literature suggests that as migrants became more assimilated, they relinquished their Italian heritage to sort of become more American citizens. And you can see how that sort of happens in a way. They stopped thinking of themselves as local terms, and they started to identify themselves as Italian American. So this is really interesting. And the second part of the question, I think I forgot. Oh yeah, the representation of the voices within the collection, which is a very good question, because women are very neglected in these collections, because the editors of these were men, and also obviously the journalists who were writing were also men. And it would be really interesting. I haven't had the chance to do that yet, but it would be really interesting to see how men talked about Italian women within their newspaper, and whether that changed at all over time as women became more included into American society and sort of relinquished their Italian heritage. So this would be definitely, this is definitely an issue with this collection, right? And with historical sources that, yeah, you give voices to the migrants, but actually you also, you can't really give voices to all, because women within that already minority community were also a minority themselves.
Deborah is asking, I think you partly answered it, which is in terms of place, can you distinguish between those markers that are remote reference of a settled migrant community and that places that indicate networks of migrant mobility? So can you distinguish?
So that's a good question as well. So a follow-up of the study would be to actually cross-reference these information, the information that we got at this stage of the process with demographics information. So, and we can already see how the clusters, obviously what happened was that Italian migrants settled in the States in specific places, and then as soon as they arrived, they started to create newspapers. So you can obviously see that where, for instance, in New York, in the New York area, there was a huge Italian community, and then in other parts, you can see clusters of references, because those are the places where migrants actually settled. But one thing that I had not told you about this collection was that, and if you are interested in the study of anarchic ways of thinking of, so basically anarchic affiliation as a way to negotiate inclusion, that is a sort of a niche subject, also very understudied. So the literature suggests that migrants, in order to be assimilated, sort of went mainstream in politics because they didn't want to be further, separated by the mainstream conversations. However, there was a huge anarchic community in the States, and one sub collection of Chronicle Italy is actually Cronaca Sovversiva, which is one of the most important anarchic immigrant newspapers in the States. And how, because it was based in Paris, Vermont, you can see how lots of clusters of references up to places are actually there. So it would be interesting to see how cross-referencing this information with demographic data about immigrants, Italian immigrants in the States, whether that actually affects how the map displays the locations.
So Margaret wanted to know, and I think I also had this question, that why only the first pages are digitized? And I'll let Xavier also ask his question, so you can answer both, and then we can go on to the next.
Absolutely, yes. Also, very good question. So for two reasons, maybe mostly. So the first reason is that at the time, obviously those newspapers should not be thought as modern contemporary newspapers, right? They were sort of struggling for all sorts of economic issues and things. So the way they were surviving was to condense most of the information on the front page, and then the third page of the newspaper was mostly job announcements. The fourth page was full advertisement, because that's how they sustain themselves. And the second page was a mix of pictures and gossip, or also information about, I don't know, gala dinners, celebrations, all sorts of things that could keep the communities together. The average length of each newspaper was 4 pages. So at this point, we thought it would be more insightful to harvest just the front page. And the second reason is because this keeps, the size of the collection sort of manageable. And for all sorts of reasons, right? Archiving, processing data, managing. So we had to compromise, but users can always go back to the original and have a look at all the other pages, because this is all open access, copyright free, published. So yeah, we encourage users to do that, to go back to the original source always.
Xavier, you want to ask your question, and then we'll.
Yeah, you kind of answered a little bit, but I'll ask it anyways. So for me, the interesting, or from my point of view, what I research is that bias behind the coloniality behind the data and the technologies that we use. So especially working with US data is heavily, I mean, you probably can confirm that, is heavily biased in the sense of the data models they use are currently not able to describe all the complexity, especially immigrant data, non-white data in particular. So just in a nutshell, what do you think are the main challenges for you kind of analyzing this kind of data in terms of the systems that need to be developed, not having enough language to describe the complexity, and then perhaps now that you are presenting a system, the challenges behind users using your data and understanding that complexity that you're presenting?
Yeah, you're right. There are so many challenges, and obviously the top challenge of all is that it's so English. When I say English, I actually mean American-centered technology, because those are where the most cutting-edge technologies come from, right? And the way they train these models, obviously, and the way they classify these models still comes from an American perspective. It's just the way it is. The way they, for instance, they categorize images, for instance, for image recognition. If the banquet, they categorize it as a banquet, but a banquet looks very different if it's a Chinese in a Chinese setting rather than an American setting. However, the system will be biased towards an American way of seeing, understanding the conviviality and the way we think about food. And this is just a tiny example, but I could go on and on and on. So basically, we need a way to sort of introduce counter narratives. And if we cannot develop our own models trained on a diversity of languages and sources, if we cannot do that for all sorts of economic reasons, of technical reasons, or whatever, then it is our duty and our responsibility to at least introduce in discourse counter narratives that at least raise awareness of the biases that are present in these collections when we use them. So the first thing that we have to do is to say, yes, it is based on data. However, be careful of the fact that it's biased, so it should always be taken with a pinch of salt. And as humanities scholars, we have to engage critically with this collection and say it's only a way to distant have sort of a perspective, but then please go back to the original source and check for yourself, because there may be biases. And in fact, when you do find biases, and you will, report them. So, we sort of start a conversation where we are used to say, yes, it is based on artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence is not the holy grail of neutrality and fairness and empirical studies. Far from it. So this is really what we can do as we sort of develop our own tools. We train more languages and more sources.
Thank you so much, Lorella.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we'll go on to, by the way, I agree with you, Xavier, with your point about Mexican food being, called food. And when it comes to Indian food, I think you might understand that even that term is so anachronistic, there is no such thing as Indian food, whatever location you're talking about it from. So yeah, these are all kind of, nuances, data nuances that you have to train students or scholars to parse. All right. Otherwise, it becomes non-contextualized and therefore fairly, uninteresting, if you will. All right. So yeah.
We end up perpetuating the same discrimination that we claim we want to break. This is the insane part. And if I just may add just one little point, as cultural heritage scholars, we have a responsibility to pass on less biased heritage for the future scholars, because obviously these are the archives of the future. So yeah, if we only pass them on biased data, the biases will never be eliminated. So this is also our responsibility.
So thank you. And so our next speaker is Javier Pereda. Xavier is a web scientist who specializes in the engagement with cultural heritage data on the web. His work focuses on the use of physical tools to reduce digital and information literacy gaps. He's currently a researcher at the Experimental Technologies Lab and a senior lecturer in graphic design and illustration at Liverpool John Moores University. His work explores user and community empowerment on the web with special attention on subaltern narratives and knowledge. His most recent research, Afrobits, received a special commendation for Best Artistic Project and shortlisted for Best Research by the British Library in 2021. So over to you, Xavier.
Okay, thank you. So let me start sharing my screen. So, all good. Everyone can see the first slide. Yeah. Well, I'm assuming, yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. So, what I'm going to be talking about is, well, design thinking. So I kind of changed the title a little bit just before the final deadline and decided just to focus more on design thinking in terms of bigger picture instead of just that tiny element of tangible interaction, although I'm going to be talking about tangible interaction as well. So the key thing in here is online cultural heritage. So what I'm going to be doing is first just give a quick introduction to the complexity behind the semantic web, which is what I specialize in. And what do I mean by online cultural heritage? I'll just give a brief explanation. Of course, it's not extensive, just very briefly explain the complexity of what I'm addressing with the link open data and the new data models. And then I'll jump into the design thinking and the interfaces that I kind of work with to kind of alleviate that that digital division with the data. So we have, first of all, online cultural heritage, and we have this massive amount of complexity and stuff, because in here the most important thing is I'm talking about heritage on the web, which means we're engaging with the world, not just with one organization. That's one of the big changes in the mind of people when they're searching for information. So all these different type of, and of course this is not extensive, it's just a small summary of kind of topics that we can find on the web. And so we can find these things in galleries, libraries, archives, museums, archaeological sites, anywhere you can think of. And the thing is, each one of these kind of objects are not limited to one institution. So if you're looking for a picture or a painting or perhaps a sculpture, where do you go? So on the web, you don't have to go to one particular place. If you're perhaps traveling, or perhaps you want to go to a place, to a specific organization, then yeah, you choose that particular place. But if you want to find the most available information about that object, you will probably most likely would like to get all the information from everywhere. And that's something very different that a lot of users, and of course general users, even specialists, have not got that information literacy of how they can query things on the web. So that is the main thing, that we no longer have these individual organizations holding the collections. So then these objects, we have now the semantic web, which now we're able to reduce the uncertainty of what's being described. Of course, there's still a colonial element with this with this approach, because most of the ontologies or the descriptions of the things have been made by these white old computer scientists, usually from well, from very privileged backgrounds. But at least what this allows us to have is data that is human readable as well as machine readable, but also reduces the uncertainty of what I'm looking for. So there's some things which are easier to access, such as a creator of an object, or perhaps tell me which organization holds this particular object, or is this part of a collection? What is it made of? Where is that object that was made of? Where is it? Where did it came from? So I want to find all artifacts in the British Museum which were made by gold extracted from mid Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. You can make those queries now. So we have now a wide range of people providing this kind of access to the collections. And actually, one of the main things that this is now becoming a standard, at least in European collections, where most of the data has to be backed up within this kind of descriptions. And this is the foundation of linked data. With linked data, we or the ontologies and data models, we use a specific or a wide range of vocabularies to describe things. So for instance, Dublin Core is mainly used by libraries because they have the way they describe things suits better for books. Then we have the Open Archives Initiative, and that's more for describing processes of heritage collections, loans, acquisitions, or managing the content. So each one of these vocabularies will be specific to describe a particular thing. Friend of a friend, for example, descriptions of people, Creative Commons about copyright, simple knowledge organization system, that's more for the web to describe parents and siblings. And then we have CDOC CRM, which is, well, this one CDOC CRM, which is one of the new standards for, at least in the UK and in European collections, of an ontology or a data model that will help us describe things. The one I'm going to be focusing on mainly is Europeana. The Europeana data model, which I have been using for a while. And what Europeana did as a European project, they gathered a lot of different ontologies and ways of describing things, and they made a new model. They made a new vocabulary or dictionary, if you want to call it in a way. So this European data managed to integrate the way galleries, libraries, archives, museum, archaeological sites, archaeologists, historians, they included and merged like every single kind of vocabulary, and they made it useful for everybody. So with European data model, we can describe things that will adapt and adopt a lot of the different languages and vocabularies from different organizations. So this is a very powerful tool, but the problem, well, I will reach that process in a bit. So the problem is no one can use that. So these semantic web data, the ontologies and the different models can be used for ingest of data, can be used for management, and can be also used for engagement as the tools that we have seen before. So we can use that data to actually engage with research, to present it for marketing, to present it for tourism, for engagement, for playful activities, you name it. So even though, I mean, the data management and the data use, or in this case, knowledge use on the web is very extensive. In my case, for this presentation, I'm only focusing on the engagement with information, which is that transition probably from sharing into its use of the data. So the presentation itself, I'm focusing on the engagement with information. So in this case, we have the engagement with information, but with semantic web data. And of course, it's a super powerful tool, but no one can actually use it. Probably you have heard of it. You probably cannot even understand it. I mean, it took me years to understand what the freaking semantic web was. Now that I know my main job or my main role as a researcher, I want to make these tools accessible for people. So the main thing about the semantic web and linked data is this three-party thing. We always work with triples of data. So a subject, a predicate, and an object. This self-portrait was made by a person. So with these kind of triples, we can guarantee when we search for things on the web, we're able to get that specific thing that we're looking for. Again, it's a nightmare to use at the moment. But for instance, we have examples such as this one, which is Mirador by IIIF, where now we have engagement tools for presenting content that is extracted or automatically extracted from all, different collections in the world. So for instance, Europeana will allow you to gather data from over 3,000 organizations across Europe. And that means billions and billions of records. So as I mentioned before, I'm focusing primarily on the engagement with the information. So you want to query a semantic web? Then the first way of how we do this is through Sparkle queries. So that's a sample of a Sparkle query that is looking for an object that has a title That title will be testa, and it will have a creator, and that creator is a person called Picasso, and perhaps find the one that has the name, the first name, Pablo. That will then connect and query the whole European repository, which is gathering data from museums, libraries, archives, everywhere in Europe, and get me the actual table of the content. That will give me the link, and I can go to the Europeana portal. In here, I'm focusing mainly on the querying. Perhaps we can talk about later how to display the content. But in this case, if you want to find the query, you have to type this super long syntax of content. And of course, that is impossible. Then on the semantic web, we have also APIs, or well, on the web in general now, which are application programming interfaces. That allows you now to create URL requests. So like when you type your website on the top, we can now produce these very complex queries, and then that will retrieve data in what is called JSON data, which is JavaScript, but it's still displayed in triples, as remember the triples I mentioned here. So we still have the triples, but now at least it makes it more accessible. But the main thing is that now with this, I can now present it in very different ways on websites. So now I have another way of presenting and engaging with the content. Now the problem is you have to type an API query or request to get the data, and then you decide what data to use. Of course, again, this is still impossible for any normal human being to engage with this, but at least we're getting somewhere. So as I mentioned before, we can then use this to present the data somehow using jQuery, using different kind of display tools using JavaScript. So what I did here is just basically I helped people putting a query by just presenting two fields. That is the most common way of how a lot of organizations have done it. So it works, but it's not really engaging. But for me, as the main thing, how do we present this kind of complexity? And especially I want people to engage with all the different data models. So I want people to produce queries that say, I want a picture from, or want paintings from Picasso that have the title Testa, that were made in Italy between the 1800s to 1950s, that are paintings, and I want to see pictures. Just as a statement, just as me saying it, it's like, oh my God, I cannot even remember what I'm trying to explore. And that's what I'm presenting today. After this massive 10 minutes of ranting, this is what I'm trying to get people to engage with, this complexity of querying the data. How the hell do you do that? And that's the beautiful challenge. So one of the ways of how design helps this kind of engagement is by using physical objects. With the physical objects, you can download that information and itemize things. And the main thing, it removes that complexity from the computer. So I've been doing a lot of research using physical tools to explore or to interact with the computer for people to extract that data. And that's what I made. So that's one of the things I made. Within design thinking as well, of course, the main way of what we see are forms in the computer, because that's the easiest way to distribute interfaces. The problem with this kind of interfaces, as you can see, they're using electronics, they're physical things. So if you want to have them, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And again, we have that problem that who's going to build that? You need to have a computer scientist in your house if you want to build that. So from design thinking perspective, what I thought, okay, this needs to be able to be built at home. So I just got an IKEA box. I made my tokens out of paper, so you can actually download this interface. You mount it on a browser, and then with the physical objects, you can make the queries. So I'll explain how this works. We have now different objects. So we have who, what, when, where, second who, second what, and then the search tool, and then have a scroll tool. So at least now what happens is that each token will embrace different data elements. So the who will extract doubling core creator, so who made the object, doubling core contributor, so which organization made the record. So you can also extract that. And that little token, when you use it, it integrates all that information in there in the API query. You will never have to deal with the API query. So that means we have, over the things I identified, there's two different things I needed to address. First, the technical element. If you cannot type a query, if you cannot type a Sparkle query, I'll remove that with the tangible interaction. And then we have the conceptual skills, the ability, your mental ability to contain all that information in a single query. As I mentioned before, just saying that query takes a long time and it's even difficult to remember without even thinking about the technical element. So on the second layer, we have the conceptual skills, which will allow you to then itemize the different elements and segment your thinking process to produce that query. We still have issues of what do I ask when I'm presenting that, well, my query to an institution or to all the institutions. So we still have some media elements and some information literacy that we need to address. But at least this also will give you kind of a starting point to know what is it that I can ask? What is it that the institutions know that I can extract? So this is a sample of the interface being used. And for instance, in here, that's the when. I'm going to fast forward this, so just to show the, so when you put an object, it will give you the option of saying or not. So that will be searching for Rodin painting. So that's the who, that's the what, start date, end date, place. So start and end date, we can also use eras. So we can say medieval, which is actually a European term, medieval to 1800. So we can combine spatial temporal elements into the query. So by rotating the object, so in this case, I probably went too fast. So by rotating the object, you can say or not. So then we can say Rodin or Picasso painting, but not a sculpture. So by itemizing each single query element, we're able to isolate also the complexity in your mind of how you explore the things or how you build that query. So what I'm trying to do here is to enable anyone, well, at least with some level of literacy, to engage with the complexity of the semantic web. But the beautiful thing is this is now retrieving data from over 2,000, 3,000 organizations across Europe. And that is a very powerful tool, at least for me. But the thing is, the exploration through the physical tools allows to reduce the complexity in your mind when you're making queries. So that final query will be using paintings, Rodin or Picasso paintings, but not sculpture from France from a particular period of time. So that query in here, that's the whole API call that is making, which is what I showed you before. So just go next. Before I started designing the interface, and this is where the design thinking comes in. When a lot of computer scientists or ourselves, when we make interfaces, we tell the user, this is what you need. We're actually not really understanding what you need. So a historian, what do a historian needs? What does an archaeologist need? What does a digital humanist need? If you're exploring geodata, what do you need? So what I did first was actually do a user-centered study where I invited a lot of people from the humanities to produce queries. So I made like 300 stickers or more, and I put them I got them to make queries using the stickers first to identify how do you, if you have all the tools in the world, what will you use and how will you start making your queries? When they were making their queries with the stickers, I was also making the API calls and also typing the Sparkle queries to see what we got. So that gave me at least an understanding of what the users, at least in this case, humanists and people from the humanities, what they might like to see in an interface or needed in an interface. So then I had to just quantify and start producing all statistical analysis of every single token. So I gave them queries and then I allowed them to search on their own. So for this query represents 3 different ways of asking for 18th century European objects from France. Again, very complex topics or very complex queries. So I had to quantify every single action. So I just made a small access database where I was just inputting the data. Meanwhile, I was rewatching the videos of the users of my experiment, and that gave me a lot of information about how to use the tools. So when we make this kind of tools, when we make this kind of engagement, we really need to embrace the narratives of the people who needs them and not impose the tools on them as well, because we're imposing all these different technologies. So at the end, this is the whole workflow of my research. So I had the problem where I had to find ways of enabling people to query semantic web data on the web. So first I had to ask people what they needed. Once I knew what they needed, then I actually started the research. So until I actually knew what they wanted, that's when I started the actual research and identifying how to solve it. So that problem solving element allowed me also to identify that despite that we could have the best tool ever, that tool still needs to be at people's homes. And how do we get a physical thing across the world? So when you can build it in your own home, that's probably the best approach, at least from my perspective. So what I've been doing, and I will just talk about this for the last 2 minutes, is enabling, finding ways of presenting and allowing people to build tools in their own home using off-the-shelf components and electronics, but still embracing all that data, connecting the data to the web and extracting all the data. And of course, there's some tools that are accessible or more accessible than others. So another of the things that we do in the research is now engaging with university students and people with low digital literacy. And what I try to do now is kind of run workshops and help people learn to develop their own interfaces. So I use a lot of artistic methodologies, printmaking, DIY technologies, for instance, ink that is conducted for people to build their own interfaces and narratives. So in a way, by facilitating the tools that already embrace the technology, at least we have a starting point for people to see, oh, this is what they have, and this is not being descripted. So just by enabling that combination of accessible tools with the connection to the semantic web, at least we have now a first stage of engaging with that content. I just went 13 seconds over. So yeah, so that's it for me. Hopefully it was interesting.
Thank you, Xavier.
Let me just check them now.
That was wonderful. I missed part of it because my internet suddenly went off. But I'm back now. So I'll start with the questions in the chat, and in between, if anyone wants to raise their hands, I'm happy to, take those questions too. Did most people want to have all that choice to make detailed searches? Because, Ben is asking this, that Google has trapped us into using keywords as a proxy for everything. And that's really a good question, because that occurred to me as you were saying this, that the whole point of Google and such interfaces is the fact that you have to put in minimal information, right? And the illusion is that you get maximum output. The problem is that, it is an illusion. And we don't see the ranking and the hierarchies in the kind of information that we are fed through that. So how do we kind of, bridge that?
Yes, so we have two things in here. So first of all is the digital literacy and media literacy. So first of all, people don't know the data elements that can be used. So for instance, there's a difference between on Google searching for Picasso as saying Picasso, the author, the human being. So Picasso could be the car, could be the painting itself, or could be the author, or could be Paloma Picasso even. So the semantic web knows the difference between the human being, the object, and the paint. So we can actually ask the query, show me all the Picassos as objects that were not made by Picasso. so Google cannot make that understanding, because the complexity is not there, even with the semantic web and artificial intelligence algorithms behind, because you have to be very explicit when you have this kind of question. So one of the problems is, or that I found as well, is that the vast majority of people around the world will not use more than 2 key terms when they're searching on the web. And that's because they don't know the different elements that they can use. When I ran my experiments, most of the people were, just for fun, they were combining at least 4 different keywords. And that's their own keywords and already has different data elements behind. So that's Booleans, data fields. So the complexity of the queries they can build were so much more extensive than what they commonly ask for in traditional web tools, as in Google search or library systems.
Nice. Shanmuga, do you have a question? Shanmuga has commented that I feel this is kind of a trick to our brains to understand the complexity of languages. So when I was learning Python, and she did that when she was a doctoral student, used text examples instead of mathematical formula to trick my brain. So you kind of learn to tweak and to kind of engage. For me, the larger question is always that, that we do that consciously, right? Because we want to understand the nuances, understand the complexities, right? Whereas, the assumption by many of the search engines is that people don't want that. They want answers, not more questions, right? Isn't that why, the algorithms are kind of set up in a way to give us the illusion of having achieved that purpose, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, right? So there's another element, which is well, within the information sciences, that the need for information. So there's different ways of how we also engage with when we make questions. So we have first the visceral engagement, or the visual kind of need, which is when we arrive to a place and I want to find the best movie to watch tonight. There's no pressure in kind of asking that question. But then we have a focused kind of a different focused need, when perhaps as a university student you actually need to find that particular book for your essay. So that adds a different level of stress. So so of course, the more specialized you are, the higher the need of your question and the higher the stress level. So also Google is not able to do that. But one thing that I'm trying to do is also alleviate that tension of the information need for the complexity that is required to retrieve that data. So of course, yeah, there is a need to facilitate the querying system as well, but not by reducing by removing by accelerating how can I put it? The uncertainty of the data. So the semantic web reduces that uncertainty. So I want to keep that certainty when I ask my query. I need to get this thing from Picasso. I don't want anybody else. I don't want to waste time discerning through all the different results. So what I get, I know will be exactly what I need, based on of how things are described, of course. But it's reducing also that noise of the results that I'm getting. So it's the similar thing when you went to a library before and you have to open the drawer still with the data, with the cards, and you have, oh my God, this is a massive mess. Where do I start? So this reduces the uncertainty as well of that data when you're querying that information.
Though there is something to be said about the the usefulness of ambiguity too, right? So Ben is asking that, do you find that having people physically make things which then connect to the web gives them a better understanding of the web, internet, and the global infrastructure that we can't see until it breaks and now take for granted? And along with that, Hannah says that, I agree so much with having the digital adapt to the people rather than the other way. But I think, that question is complicated. And I'll just add one more thing, and you can just take all of these things together to explain, which is that, it is something that I often ask my scientist friends, is that when it always seems that technology is so conceptually patriarchal, right? In the sense that, every technology is by default made for the Eurocentric white male. Uh, and whatever little strides that we may have made socially never reflects in a new technology. So in a new technology, you're always starting from square one, whether it is algorithms or evolutionary algorithms or what have you. So how do we get technology to that point where you are at least factoring in the mini steps that we may have made in any particular this, right? So if you can just kind of take all of those things together in terms of infrastructure and platform politics, if you will, and see how you may help us understand that.
So I'm gonna give you first an oversimplistic answer, and then I'll open the can of worms. So the best approach is user-centered design, participatory design. You bring in your users, which in this case will be the community, and you develop your interface with that, and that reflects to data collection, to the sharing data, engagement with the data, development of the systems, development of the tools, learning, so curriculum. So we need to embrace the community within the processes, ingest, sharing, and engagement. And of course, in here, I just been talking about engagement, and that's the kind of worms. So of course, developing the language. So one of the new things that we're exploring is, for instance, we have already the semantic web working. It works. It's not perfect, but it works. So now the next stage is, okay, what things are not able, for instance, yeah, and I'll explain this more in detail. So what is that we're not able yet to explain? Because of course, what we have so far, we are able to explain the world in binary, as in this is true or not. So what happens with fuzzy data, especially in the humanities? So it's either ones or zeros, true or false. So if it's not true, then it's automatically false. It doesn't matter, there's no midway. So there's a lot of data, let's say, from Mesoamerican narratives or Indian narratives as well, that is the way that we describe things, the way we describe the world, we're not able yet to embrace those narratives. So the next stage is also bringing those communities and developing those new ontologies and languages. So in order for them to showcase and express the cosmovision of those different groups. So all those different subaltern groups are not part of the semantic web yet, are as in the language. So for instance, when I was doing the experiments, I was looking for one Aztec god as a who, and I couldn't find it, and I was like frustrated. There's no way that this is not on the records. I was thinking, how come no one, the whole freaking Europe has this artifact? And then I thought, okay, it's a what? So Europeans describe Tlaloc, the god, as a what instead of a who, because for Mexicans it's a who. And that was like, that's when I realized, okay, semantic web, and that's when I started clicking. It's about how things are described, and that relates to Lorella's issue that, okay, it is working, but we're still working with white technologies. But now we are in the perfect point to allow these subaltern groups to say, okay, I'm not able to say this. How can we say it? I'm not able to say Tlaloc is a person, or was a person eventually. And but we need to first embrace what is actually working for us to expand it and change it. So in a nutshell, it's basically bringing the community within the research, sharing, ingest, sharing, and engagement in the three process of the heritage practice.
Yeah, thank you, Xavier. There are a couple more questions, but I think we will go on to the next speaker. But I would like to end by saying that I think what all of that means, like taking your paper as well as Lorella's points, is that we need the digital space to be a far more cacophonic in terms of languages, voices, narratives. If at all, we have to have some sense of representation, isn't it? And certainly we in India, feel that a lot in terms of the multilingual web, and something that is always part of discourses as well as experiments, and so yeah. So we'll come to our last speaker. We are on time, but a few minutes behind, but that's all right. Our last speaker is Hannah. Hannah started her CDA Oral Histories Design, a creative collaboration. Sounds like an awesome title. Sustaining visitor reuse of oral histories on heritage sites. This January at Newcastle University. Her CDA is in collaboration with the National Trust site, Seaton Delaval Hall, the Oral History Unit at Newcastle University, and the Design School at Northumbria University. The project involves recording oral histories from the community that surrounds the hall and then using these as the foundation to build a sustainable archive. The archive will be built through design thinking workshops together with the hall's community, National Trust staff, and the respective universities. So over to you, Hannah.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Okay, so this is indeed about oral history design and sustaining visitor reuse at oral heritage sites. The specific heritage site is, as said, Seaton Delaval Hall, which is a National Trust site. It was built in 1720, and its residents, the gay Delavals, became renowned for their wild parties and all sorts of other shenanigans. However, in 1822, there was a big fire and part of the hall burnt down, and the whole main hall was completely gutted. All of the wood disappeared. This particular history from 1720 to 1822 is well represented in the collection at the hall through paintings and other archival material. However, its recent history, so the history of the community that looked after the hall after it burnt down, when the hall was a prisoner of war camp during both world wars, and the most recent history, which was when the late Lord Hastings would host medieval banquets for the local community after the hall's restoration. All of this history is not represented in the collection. Luckily, we have oral history, which kind of allows us to capture this currently predominantly undocumented history of the hall. However, there is a big but, and that is that oral history has a deep, dark secret. After the recordings have been made and analysed, they are often locked up in an archive, put in some historian's cupboard in their office, and never used again. They are, as Michael Frisch says, more like a shoebox of unviewed home videos than anything particularly, usable. They're full of beautiful memories, but no one really watches them because it takes too much time, or they simply don't have a video player anymore. Which I think in the case of Seaton Delaval Hall is really sad. Its strength as an institution is that it has this deep connection with its local community, and so if the community that gives these oral histories then doesn't have access to them, it just seems a shame. And I personally think that it's also an ethical problem where we have big power dynamics where a massive institution like the National Trust takes from the local community, takes this history, but then doesn't give anything back. So we want to avoid that, which is why I have been given the challenge to make oral histories reusable for the visitors of the hall. And so this is a very complex problem. So I've kind of focused in on one element of it to fit it in within the 15 minutes. And I'm going to focus in on sustainability. How can we make a sustainable storage system for these oral histories? I'm also using the term storage system instead of archive, because I believe that the term archive is really quite loaded and is culturally often represented as something that is like exclusive for the elite, is not necessarily open to the masses. So, sustainable storage system. So I'm going to start with the people who are at the center of the storage system, and that is the visitors and volunteers. These are the people who are the sources, the source of the oral histories, they will be donating their oral histories to the hall. Now, due to the usual time and financial constraints, the initial period of recording will in no way be able to capture all of the stories that are available in the community. So this storage system needs to be able to house these initial recordings, but also allow the visitors and volunteers to add their stories over time, to reflect on stories that are already contained within the system, maybe comment on them, maybe, you know, add new stories to a similar story, that kind of stuff. So in the case of the visitors and volunteers, sustainability means that it has to be dynamic. The system has to be dynamic in order for it to be useful for the community.
Hannah,
Yeah?
I'm really sorry to interrupt you. I don't think we're seeing your slides moving forward.
Oh no! Okay, well I'm going to start here.
Sorry for the interruption.
No, honestly, I feel that I've worked on this slide, so I'm glad that you guys can now enjoy them.
Thank you.
So, sustainability for the visitors equals a dynamic system. In the case of the other group of people who will be interacting with the storage system, so is the National Trust staff, the people who will be running the storage system and looking after it. In my opinion, the sustainability equals user-friendliness. The system needs to be user-friendly for the National Trust staff so that they can use it easily, but also that they can then train other people to use it. So these two groups and their needs, I believe, can be supported by the digital. I think that we're all perfectly aware that the digital is pretty awesome. I mean, everyone from all across the world, as is proving now, can upload, download, and browse an amazing amount of content. And increasingly, it's become part of our everyday lives. I mean, this has become a rather familiar sight during the pandemic. We've kind of been propelled into using digital mediums more. I know for a matter of fact that my granddad, who did have a smartphone at the beginning of the pandemic, now has a smartphone and a pad and quite an impressive Facebook following for his satirical cartoons on the UK government. So everyone, is getting more digital in their lives, and this also goes for institutions, especially in the cultural sector, who need to use digital tools in order to keep their audience. So the digital is very much in our everyday lives, at least here in the UK. How does the digital help the Seat Indelible Hall situation? How can they complete the wish list of the community of Seat Indelible Hall? Well, I think it's quite clear that the internet is quite dynamic. We're able to upload and comment on pretty much everything, so that's covered. Its user-friendliness, I think, again, to repeat similar words, is that the user-friendliness can be achieved by having the staff and the users involved right at the beginning of the design process. So again, looking at that user-centered design. So that will be covered. Another thing that I think the digital can deliver is storage systems. It's really good at storing stuff. I mean, my hard drive is tiny, but I can put a crazy amount of stuff on it. However, because we're able to restore and record everything, we also create this desperate need to store and record everything, which at the same time creates a huge sense of loss when something isn't recorded or stored. As soon as you're able to capture something, you also create a bunch of stuff that isn't captured. I mean, and technology plays a really big role in this. I mean, just look at oral history. Oral history as a field exists solely because we're able to record people's voices. But that also means that we record we also, you know, have a bunch of voices that haven't been recorded, that haven't been captured. So then we move on to the question of, should we record everything? Because we can record everything. It's tempting to record everything, but then you have everything, and that is useless. You can't search that. I mean, we also already have this problem with our analog archives. I was talking to the archivist of the Parliamentary Archives, and they said that they had calculated how long it would take for them and their colleague to digitize everything in the Parliamentary Archives, and that would be 120 years. So just imagine, and that's just analog stuff. That's not even, you know, the amount of digital content that is created every second. We can't, you know, we can't keep this stuff. And so then we move on to questions of value. What do we want to keep? What do we, you know, what do we value now? Whose voices do we value? But more importantly, whose voices will we value? What will the next generation wish that we would have kept? And this, in combination with trying to keep a healthy digital ecosystem, is like really complicated, because we don't want the digital system to collapse in on itself under its just sheer weight of stuff that it collects. But I think it's also important to remember that the digital is still very, very young. It's enthusiastic. It's okay. It's good at collecting stuff, but there are still gaps. There are gaps in the digital. I think, for example, a lot of search functions on online archives don't necessarily return what you wanted to. We have that kind of like Google keyword problem. And also you kind of lose the serendipitous feeling that you have in brick and mortar archives, the kind of stumbling upon stuff. A search bar for me is not going to replace an archivist who has, you know, extensive knowledge of their collection. So I don't think robots are ready to replace humans yet. But that's okay, because, you know, humans can easily fill in the gaps. If the digital allows it, the humans can very easily fill in these gaps. I think one of the interesting kind of like blend of human and digital I've witnessed is when researchers who have not got access to certain archives have used their human network to get access. So they've called up someone who does have access to the archive, got them to, you know, take a picture of a document, scan it in, you know, transcribe it. And so we get this kind of cyborg moment where in order to do research, we need to have humans, but also this amazing communication technology that we have now. So if we go back to the National Sea Indelible Hall, the digital will absolutely support the needs of the visitors and volunteers and the National Trust staff through user-friendly and dynamic systems. But at the same time, the visitors and volunteers and the staff need to be able and need to be free to fill in the gaps that the digital has. But there's an extra layer I need to add to this, and that is the environment. The environment does influence our access to places of storage like museums and galleries and archives and libraries. And we're all very aware of this. You know, the pandemic has cut us off to brick and mortar archives, but at the same time, a power cut could cut off access to, you know, could cut power to the servers, and then we would lose access to online archives. And earthquakes, storms, all of this stuff could take out all of these brick and mortar and digital archives. And as we know, the environment is only increasingly going to become a bigger problem. So in order to have, you know, this sustainable storage system where we have this beautiful, you know, cyborg human digital blend, we also need to make sure that it is sustainable for the world, which might mean that we shouldn't solely rely on, you know, data servers, which use up an immense amount of energy. I think this, in combination with the gaps that the digital has, we can't completely rely on the digital to, you know, deliver us a sustainable archive, a sustainable storage system. But at the same time, I'm also perfectly aware that brick and mortar archives are not dynamic at all. they are very static, and we've now lost complete access to them due to a pandemic. So I think for Seat and Deliverable Hall, we need a system that kind of floats in between these two worlds, between the digital and the analog, but at its center, as in user-centered design, needs to have the humans that, you know, give their stories to the storage system and are the sole reason for its existence. And so I hope that by approaching this challenge with a kind of cyborg mindset, but constantly keeping in mind the influence and the impact it might have on the environment, that I will be able to, you know, make the stories of Seat and Deliverable Hall available for generations to come. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah, for a wonderful session. And anybody wants to ask questions? Let me take questions from here. Complex but entirely necessary ethical protocols mitigate against reuse and sharing of collections of oral testimonies. Are there particular ethical requirements, challenges associated with the collections, you know, that you are working with, and can they be digitized? You know, I think that's a great question, because that's always a challenge when you're working with, you know, oral histories, oral narratives, oral testimonies. Fine.
I think oral histories are particularly complex when it comes to these kind of like reuse, because you know, they are recorded in a really specific moment in time, and so reflect the position of that person. You know, we're dealing with memory and all sorts of stuff. And I think there was a case where someone had done an oral history on some housewives in Australia in the mid-80s, and then later someone dug up these oral histories and was like, oh, these women are all racist, and then wrote an article about how racist housewives of Australia were in the 80s, and the housewives of Australia were like, but I didn't give permission for my voice to be used like that. So, and you know, people do change their mind, and so that kind of ethical issue of, you know, allowing research, allowing reuse is dangerous. So you kind of do need an openness about it. It's a really complicated problem.
It is very complicated, especially if you're dealing with repositories like, you know, of communities, you know, that perhaps, you know, don't have their own script, for example, you know, and have always told their stories orally. So when you're digitizing it and giving it a certain kind of a permanence in terms of narrative, I think there are some, so you can follow ethical processes that are laid down by our structures of research, you know, and then we can pat ourselves on the back and say that, okay, you know, we have followed those processes, except that those communities are often outside those structures themselves and had no say in creating those ethical standards, or, you know, in those ethical structures. So it's a very, I think, especially in places like India or in indigenous communities of Australia or New Zealand, this is a very tough question that I don't think there are answers to. I mean, it's not even just not easy, it's almost, you know, impossible to answer that. I think Deborah had her hand up. Deborah, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, sorry, no, it was just if you wanted me to say that question rather than you read it, but no, that's fine, perfectly. Can I just add, actually, since I'm here, do you actually have collections of oral materials that you can access and potentially digitize as part of your project, Hannah? I wasn't quite sure if there was actually a body of material that you're looking to digitize.
I'm making it from scratch, which is quite, you know, it's quite the opportunity. But it's, again, quite a strange thing, because a lot of the oral historians who I talk to, they record for a purpose to like analyze these oral histories. I'm not doing that. I'm literally going to record people so that they can then reuse it. So it's one of those strange things where I am like, I'm not yeah, I'm here to listen to your stories. I'm not going to use them at all.
So you'll give them the copy. Will there be a recording, but you'll give them the copy? You won't retain a copy of the recording of the conversation?
Well, no, I think it would be left at the Indelible Hall, but it won't. I'm not going to, you know, write an opinion piece on, write a piece on like, well, the Indelible Hall has, you know, this is the idea of the working classes or something like that around the Indelible Hall. I'm just being like, here are your stories. I've recorded them. If you want to add stuff, if you want to go back, then.
Well, I think this is. Javier's nodding, and I think this relates to his question of citizen science, which I've never thought of intersecting with oral testimony. So I'll let him pick that up, it's really very interesting.
Yes, so I'm thinking, for instance, of course, this is a very ill-informed opinion because I'm not a historian, but I'll just play. So all I do is I just play with your data. So I will probably from an engagement point of view. But for instance, yes. So I will see this as kind of the endangered heritage as well. So there is this kind of thing which will disappear, and of course, so from the cultural perspective, I wouldn't even pay attention, of course, within this dialogue, that opinion made by a journalist, because it's not a non-specialist. So within the ethical and correct research, then I think we can. I'm going to isolate from that narrative of a non-expert, which that just gives random opinions in general, especially with the current media. So I think from your perspective, I think you're in the complete perfect position to embrace those narratives. So for instance, from the citizen science perspective, is the idea is, okay, you can record this and you also ask them, what is that you would like to ask? And that same system, for instance, there's this system called Archival, which is mainly for built heritage, but allows you to record, I mean, also uses a data model, which I think is essential to contextualize what's been recorded. But I think the beautiful thing is once it's in a system, what can you ask from it? So even though, again, we still have a lot of bias towards the data and the query systems and the tools, but at least it's a starting point. So for instance, the Library of Congress has a lot of oral history, which then is translated to text. And that means once you have in a machine readable text, that means tell a computer to do whatever you want. And I think that is the beautiful aspect of it. So within the citizen science approach, you can provide just kind of a starting point of a workflow of how things can be put in within the system. And of course, this is not for journalism, it is for the good of humanity as much as we can. But I think if we identify what needs to be kept for them, what needs to be kept for heritage, what needs to be kept for linguists, and so on, we can at least use some of the data models to describe and preserve that in an unbiased way to a certain level, of course, but at least we'll reduce the uncertainty, will help with the preservation of data and the provenance of the data as well. I think that will help a lot, kind of also getting non-experts to make sense of what's there. Anyways, so yeah, that's it. So yeah, so if you can expand a little bit more, what do you think of this, of using, how do you facilitate the system, as in everything you're doing, to your community or the communities you're engaging with?
I mean, I've just started, so I think a lot of it, for me, I imagine it is, you know, so my MA was in innovation, so I did a lot of design thinking stuff. So it is kind of building collectively with the community around it. I see myself far more as a project manager of just kind of being like, okay, you need to talk to this person and then we can, you know, swap ideas, rather than someone who is kind of imposing my ideas on people. I'm kind of like more building structures and giving them. I'm a provider of tools, but also being like, but here are some tools so that you can make tools that are helpful for you. So it's kind of, that's kind of what it is. And it is indeed completely, you know, interdisciplinary. You know, I am from an art background, but I've somehow ended up in an oral history department doing a design thing. So I question a lot of things because I'm a complete outsider nearly all the time. But I'm therefore also open to people telling me like, oh, this is how we do it. I'm like, okay, cool, but why? And I think
it really goes into the heart of that interoperability question, isn't it? In some ways. And I'm looking at, Deborah's comment, which I think is, which makes me think about the alignment of this discussion with the vexed question of translation, transliteration, and cultural translation in literature. So it seems to me, when Deb is talking about the dynamic and static aspects of the archive. So if you look at archives not merely as repositories, but in some ways, kind of discourse and conversations about power structures, I think, that will, if you understand that, I think it will help us to use Xavier's point to make it less biased. It will never be completely unbiased, but at least, move in the direction of making it a little less biased and more representative. I think there are no more questions. Oh, yes, Lorella, you had a question? Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I just raised my hand just now, but it's not really a question. It's more like a comment on what you just said, Nirmala, that it's understanding repositories really as part of wider conversations even, right? Not just interlinked with each other, but just as part of a wider discourse that was happening at the time. And I think the problem with the digital is that we impose digital methodologies on those sources. We forget that the way NLP techniques are designed is by analyzing these collections as discrete data that are, not connected with each other. So each text is something that starts and ends it. And this is roughly speaking, right? But there is no really concept of how these things are actually part of wider conversations, right? So they are interpreted as being in a vacuum, if you will. And this is the problem with also using, understanding digital cultural heritage as data. That's something you have to always bear in mind, because obviously digital cultural heritage is not really data, is sources still. And we should still treat them as such. So at least, because obviously there is no other way at the moment, to my knowledge, to actually analyze these unprecedented masses of the digital in a way that does not really impose discrete concepts of thinking of corpus or corporate, then one thing that we should do is always add like a critical layer, as you sort of said, like, right, understanding these collections as part of wider political and power structures and dynamics. This is something that NLP still can't do. But again, coming back to what I said before, it's something that we as digital scholars, digital humanities scholars should bring into the conversation. This is what we have to add to the table, I think, our critical insights.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would end by saying that, I do look at all these tools and methodologies as, I forget the name of, someone who said that, there are a set of intelligent tasks, and, we kind of perform those intelligent tasks, and those intelligent tasks together would give us an intellectual vocabulary. And that, and that's what it hopefully will lead to some sort of, intellectual conversations. So, that difference between epistemology and ontology, right, in some, in a digital sense. And we still don't know what that is for the digital, but it is okay that it takes its time forming, if that makes any sense. So thank you all very much, and thank you to all the participants for the questions. And it was wonderful to know you all and, be able to say hi, even if it is virtually. And hopefully, Deborah, we will still be able to have a workshop in person sometime before the end of the year. Yeah. Thank you all. Bye-bye. Thanks to Rihanna, Catherine, Shanmuga, all of you who were involved in the...
Yes, thank you very, very much to everyone.